The Center for American Heritage is a new organization. What you hear all the time is how we need to get back to our constitutional roots, but nobody ever goes back and says, where did this country come from? What are the philosophies upon which it's based? The Constitution was not written in a vacuum. So what led to its creation? What were those gentlemen thinking? The center is presenting a vision of America that we can use not just to analyze what happened, but how we move forward in creating a consistent and coherent package to solve the problems confronting us. I am going to be quoting people from a variety of faith traditions. This is neither an endorsement nor an indictment of any of those traditions, and it has no bearing whatsoever on any content of any faith. It is strictly what these people are saying in the historical record, and that is all I am talking about. Similarly, I am going to be talking about a variety of issues in terms of how effective that special interest group is in moving its point of view forward. That does not mean I either agree or disagree with some of the issues. As a matter of fact, some of the groups that I'll be saying have done a wonderful job of moving their point of view forward I vehemently disagree with and have been debating for 30 years. That does not negate the fact that they have been politically effective. So you need to take content out and think about structure in this presentation, okay? Oh, do I need to do this?
You got to point it to this up here.
Oh, wow, this is very technical.
And there's a page up, page down. It's not the arrow buttons.
So am I paging down? Or am I paging up? All right, you know what? I'll tell you what. If I just do this, can you move it? That'll work better and faster, because I'm not technical. Flip it. Okay. This presentation is called The Foundations of Liberty. As Jim said, it usually takes me a morning to do this. It is part of an all-day seminar that the Center for American Heritage has done, mostly at this point across Pennsylvania, so you need to speed up your ears. I will tell you it is not a problem for me to speed up my mouth. So you just need to keep your ears up. I could be an auctioneer with no training. Flip it. In any society, the first question that needs to be asked is who's in charge of the society? Somebody has to be able to make the decisions to say, where does that bridge get built? How does trade happen? Who decides the currency? And throughout history, basically, there have been three choices for who's in charge. The first choice could be the church. When the church is solely in charge, the church law is state law. You have to be a practicing member of that church in order to be considered a citizen. If the state is separate from the church, it's an arm of the church. In other words, if they have a separate election, it has to be approved by the church. We would call those theocracies. There have been many examples throughout the world. In the modern world, the one people are most familiar with, of course, is Islam, where those two things are intertwined. So the church could be solely in charge of society. Second, the state could be solely in charge of society. That's our friend Mr. Hitler on the top. When the state's solely in charge, the state decision is the only authority that can happen. Churches are usually closed. Worship is forbidden because the state doesn't like the competition. An individual person is only a citizen if the government declares you to be. If you have not been declared to be a citizen, you are the property of the government, and they can do anything that they want with you. The third option is that the people are in charge. Now, that little convoluted chart up there is actually the government of ancient Athens, which everybody thought is the finest shining example of pure democracy in the world. It was a very convoluted system. In the system where the people are in charge, the citizens become the state. So whatever the majority of those participating decide is the answer. There's no limits on what the people can decide. Whatever the people decide is correct is correct. Now, we're all very familiar with the Athenian model, at least we think we are. In Athens, they had to have a quorum of citizens come together in order to vote. They had the same problem in ancient Athens that we have today. People didn't come. So first, they tried to bribe them, and it became a huge drain on the treasury of the city because they paid them to come to vote. When they couldn't afford that anymore, they actually took red ropes, painted them red, sent the slaves out into the countryside, all holding ropes like a big fence around the city, and the slaves walked toward the middle of the city. And if you had a red paint on the back because you were one of the last ones into the assembly, then you paid a fine, because that was how they tried to get the people to show up to participate. Because there were no limits on what the state could decide, the people couldn't be wrong. So, for example, in Athens, there was a situation where a bunch of sailors, there had been a big battle, the Athenians won, On the way back, there was a storm, ships foundered, the generals didn't go back to pick up the soldiers and sailors who were drowning. The generals were accused en masse in front of the Assembly of Athens, and they were executed. A gentleman named Socrates, you're probably familiar with him, reminded the Athenian assembly that it was against Athenian law to put people on trial en masse. You had to do it one at a time, but they had already killed the generals. So since the assembly couldn't be wrong, the response of the assembly was to put on trial the people who had accused the generals, and then they executed them as well, because they had misled the assembly. So when the people are in charge, there's absolutely no limits on what the people can decide. History basically has been a struggle for power between some combination of those three groups. If the struggle is between two nations, we call it a war. If it's inside a nation, it can go all the way to a rebellion or a revolution. I don't want to do the history of the world, so we're going to start with Rome, because that's where Western civilization as we know it. So the basic conflict was the Roman Empire versus the early Christians. They had two worldviews. The empire, oh, it didn't translate perfectly. The empire said there were many gods. The emperor, however, was one of them. So the emperor was divine. There could be no limits on what the emperor did. So the authority of the state was unlimited. The Christians had a problem. Now, if the Christians had just added this Christ person, the empire would have been like, we don't care. Put a temple around the corner behind the block. We're pantheistic. They allowed all of the places that they conquered to keep their national gods. You could have household gods. They made an allowance for the Jews over there in Israel. They paid a fine because they wouldn't worship, but they kind of stayed over there. The problem was these Christians didn't just say this Christ person additionally, they said only. And if it was only, the second piece of that was that the emperor, therefore, was not divine. If the emperor was not divine, then there were limits on the authority of the state. From the point of view of Rome, that would be called treason. So I need you to flip the slide. That would be called treason. Now, the empire really wasn't looking for a war. They were very practical people. They didn't want to blow their empire up. So originally, that would be considered civil disobedience, and Rome punished them. They paid fines to them. As a matter of fact, there's letters between Pliny and Trajan, who was the emperor at the time, saying, I've got these people. They've been accused of being Christians. I brought them in. We brought in your statue. They stood there. They watched the worship in front of your statue. They said a nasty thing about this Christ person. I let them go. And the emperor wrote back and said, good, good. We're not looking for a war. We want the empire to keep going. The problem was the Christians wouldn't do that. They would not stand silently in witness when you sacrificed to the emperor. They would not say nasty things about this Christ person. And so it moved to persecutions, which eventually intensified because the Christians just refused to comply. And eventually wound up with our friends in the Colosseum with the lions. And of course, not one Christian ate one lion. If you were the sportscaster, you would have said lions 2,000, Christians 0, because all the Christians died. There's something absolutely irresistible about a faith that people believe in so strongly that they're willing to get eaten by a lion for. And so Christianity continued to grow until we get to the end of the 300s. And in the end of the 300s, the emperor at the time was Theodosius. He actually enacted in 391 the Theodosian decrees, in which he took all of Roman law, codified it into one place in a civil code, and said everybody, including myself, the emperor, has to comply with this. So the empire bowed and agreed that the emperor himself was also responsible for his behavior and had to obey the same laws as everybody else. Now, if you read the Theodosian decrees, you would think that they were fairly barbaric because they had rules about how you treat slaves. One of the things that it did, which was kind of unusual in history, was to say that women were not slaves, that women could own property, and that women were full legal agents. As the church moved across Europe and moved the laws into compliance with church teaching, in every country but one, they made women not slaves. The exception was Ireland. The original Brehon codes, not only were women not slaves, women owned all the land because no Irish man in his right mind would dare to tell an Irish woman that she was a slave. I can attest to that. I'm an FBI full-blooded Irish. My husband says you can always tell an Irish girl, you just can't tell her much. That would be true. Now that was followed in the late 400s. Athanasius was the emperor. Gelasius was the pope. They were fighting about who was going to be in charge. Gelasius writes a letter to Athanasius, and in the letter, which is not very long, he postulates what came to be known as the two-sword theory. The two-sword theory says there's two authorities by which the world is ruled. Spiritual authority, which is in the purview of the church. Civil authority, which is the voice of the state. The same hand should not hold both swords. They should be separate. And in the separation, freedom can be preserved. Now, that theory was promulgated throughout Europe, and everybody agreed with it. And so Europe, basically, for 1,000 years, was governed by it. Was it perfect? No. Each side fought to get control, because people are people. But it is the reason, if you've ever studied history, probably the most famous is, Charlemagne. Remember the musical Pippin and all. Charlemagne was crowned. That's a picture of Charlemagne being crowned. He was crowned by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800. Why? Because the two-sword theory said the empire bows to Charlemagne, but Charlemagne bows to God. Charlemagne is not divine. He is accountable for his behavior and performance just like every other man. And it is the purview of the church authorities to say to the government, you may have made that legal, but it's wrong, and you have to stop. And that was the balance. Now, Europe was basically governed by that, and we're going to move to England next because this is American history that we're talking about. In England, when we get to 1100, King Henry I was the king. You probably remember the Battle of 1066, the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror. Henry comes in, he's the king. He creates the Charter of Liberties. He addresses it to the bishops, but he begins by saying, because the kingdom has been oppressed through the fear of God, because remember, I'm accountable for my behavior, the very first thing I'm going to do is make the church free of state interference, all the way back to 1100, because there had been the push me, pull you. So in 1100, in order to stop oppression, we have to make the church free of state interference. The Magna Carta, the one we're all very familiar with, was King John. He begins by talking about the grace of God. He says that he's signing this for the health of his soul and the honor of God and the better ordering of his kingdom. That's why he said he signed the Magna Carta. He addresses it to all of the bishops and the barons. He begins by saying that the first thing we need to do is make the church free in order to have the glory of God and honoring of our kingdom and all freedoms be preserved. The church has to be free. Not only does he say it at the beginning of the Magna Carta, he says it at the end. This is how the Magna Carta ends. It is accordingly our wish and command that the church shall be free, and that way the men shall keep their liberties. The two-sword theory, separation. The same hand can't hold both swords. Now, the Magna Carta really only lasted 3 weeks, because John was actually a very bad man. He died less than a year later of dysentery, and he was succeeded, and Edward's actually his grandson. In 1297, Edward, basically that's the Magna Carta, the one that actually became the basis of English civil law, was actually written in 1297. And he again says that we've granted to God and have confirmed forever that the church shall be free and have her rights and liberties unviolated. And that's how freedom goes for people. So that the government cannot control the church. Now, that charter was reconfirmed by one king after another until we get to our friend Henry VIII. And we've all heard of Henry VIII. He's so famous, children write stories about, sing a song about him. Henry VIII had a small problem. He wanted a male heir. Catherine gave him Mary, who was a female. Henry, in 1534, decided he really did kind of like Anne Boleyn, who was the sister of Mary Boleyn, who was one of his mistresses, but Anne didn't want to be a mistress. She only wanted a different job title, Mrs. And so she would not consent to his enticements unless he married her. In 1534, he had Parliament pass the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy declared that Henry was the only supreme head on earth of the church in England, and that the crown would now have all of the honors and dignities that come with being the head of the church. Now, Henry was not just in love with Anne Boleyn. Henry was a really smart politician. He was a very smart man. He did not have Parliament confer upon him to be the head of the Church of England. The Act of Supremacy says, we, the Parliament, recognize that he's always been the head of the Church of England. We were just too dumb to see it before. If I confer it, I can take it back. If I recognize that it's always been there, Parliament couldn't remove it. It was there forever. Henry also, so he grabbed both swords. And all ecclesiastical leaders now served at the pleasure of the crown. So if he went to the convocation of the clergy and said that they were going to have to review all canon laws and they would all have to be approved by the king in order to stay a canon law, he took control of both swords. Henry, and I'm kind of racing you through history, died. We had Edward, we had Mary, we moved to Elizabeth. Elizabeth reconfirms what Edward did in the Acts of Supremacy, and she makes them stronger. She passes the Uniformity Acts. This is actually the third version of the Uniformity Acts. Edward did two. Mary came in, set some aside. Elizabeth came back, repassed them. Now, the Uniformity Acts say that the Queen will determine all of the way that religious celebrations and rituals will be conducted in England, and that if any person refuses to do it the way the Queen said, the first time they'll go to jail for 6 months without bail, the second time for a year without bail, the third time they'll go to jail for life without bail, if they won't worship the way that the Queen says that they have to worship. Now, who did not, and she required an oath of supremacy. Henry did as well. Elizabeth recodified it, saying that I testify in my conscience that the Queen is the only governor of the realm in spiritual, ecclesiastical, and temporal causes. And if you did not swear that oath, you could not hold any office in England anywhere. So the grab of the two swords and putting them in the control of the crown by the time Elizabeth came in was absolutely complete. Now, obviously, all of England wasn't very happy with that, and they had a lot of issues. Elizabeth dies childless. Crown passes to her cousin, who was James IV of England and Scotland, and became James I of England. This was a totally different theology than what has been happening in Europe. Remember the Charter of Liberties for all the two-sword theories. So James has to now flesh out a theology to make what just happened have a background underneath it. So he goes in front of Parliament in March of 1609, and this is what he says, among a bigger speech. He says, kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself, they're called gods. So it is sedition to dispute anything a king may do in the height of his power. Nero would be proud. This is the Roman emperor all over again. King is divine. King is divine. That's the divine right. Now, James hires a theologian. His name was Robert Filmer. That's his picture up there, to write a book to flesh this out for folks. Filmer does write a book. It's called Patriarcha, or the Natural Power of Kings Defended Against the Unnatural Liberties of the People. It was written in 1630 by Robert Filmer. Now, in the 1600s, when you wrote a persuasive book, what you would typically do is you would say, my opponent is George Blankenschmiel. This is what George Blankenschmiel says. And then you spend the rest of the book telling everybody why George Blankenschmiel is an idiot. So Filmer did that. He said, this is the beginning of his book. He says, the argument that is used against me was made by a guy named Bellamy. It's the one and only argument that is the proof of the natural liberty of the people. And this is what Bellamy says. God has given and ordained power, but not to one particular man, because by nature all men are equal. Therefore, he's given power to the multitude. That's what Bellamy said. Those words should sound familiar to you. Well, what actually did Bellamy say, and where did Bellamy say it? Bellamy, who lived in the 1600s, his name was Robert. He was a cardinal, and he and Filmer were kind of they had this debate that was going on across Europe. What did he say? He wrote, it was called De Leges, which was a treatise on civil government. He said, in the Commonwealth, all men are born free and equal. Mankind is endowed and born with freedom and at liberty to choose what form of government it pleases. The people themselves hold power, so long as they haven't transferred it to a king. And so for legitimate reasons, the people can change the government. It depends upon the consent of men to place over themselves. That should sound familiar as well. Well, it sounded familiar to a man whom we know very well, because his name was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of Patriarcha in his library. His handwriting is all over it, so we know he read it. Well, Jefferson basically paraphrased Bellarmine in words that we know very, very well. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. When government becomes destructive, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. The words of the Declaration were originally written in the 1600s by a guy named Robert Bellamy. Jefferson paraphrased. Now, when we talk about our Declaration, he said endowed by their Creator. Everybody says that the American Declaration came from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The Virginia Declaration of Rights says men are by nature free and independent. Jefferson inserted Creator. The question is, why? Those words, remember, every word of the Declaration was fought over for days in that very hot day. So he inserted the word Creator because he was reasserting the two swords. He was saying there's an authority higher than the government. Because if there's not an authority higher than the government, there can never be a just cause for rebellion. If the government is all there is, you can never legitimately revolt. That was what James said. It was sedition to stand against a king. Jefferson said, no, there's an authority above the king. And that's the authority to which we're appealing when we founded this country. He meant to introduce Creator. So the question that they had was then, well, how do you build a government to make that America a reality? Well, our friends came back to our friend Bellamy. Remember the treatise in which the original language. Bellamy talked about what a government should look like. He said there should be a distribution of power with a central head and minor heads who are not just agents, but in their own territory, they're supreme. They only come together in matters of national security and general import. Bellarmine said, with the supreme head, minor heads like governors, legislators, and judges, and they would be independent in their own areas, and that the government would have democratic elements to ensure that incompetent rulers would be protected, people would be protected against incompetent rulers, and that the people would have the highest right of liberty and approval and participation and public welfare. This should sound familiar, because our Constitution has an executive branch with one person so you can get stuff done, a judicial branch that is supposed to give wise counsel. We won't talk about whether they do, but that was the intent. They're independent and they're supposed to be stable. And we have a legislative branch that is subject to continuous approval of the people to help ensure against incompetent rulers. They took Bellarmine very seriously, though, because they added the 10th Amendment so that the states would have real and supreme authority in their own territory. They took Theodosius and put it together in the United States Constitution to protect the people. So when they wrote the Constitution, they did some really amazing things. The last thing they did was they redefined the people. Before America, the people, the citizens, you weren't considered citizens, you were subjects of a king or your emperor or whatever. You belonged to the king. Any representative body only met at the pleasure of the king, and we have lots of instances throughout English history, as a matter of fact, even here in America before the Revolution, where the king said, well, you know, that Virginia Assembly, we don't like you too well. You can't meet anymore. You just can't do that. You only convened at the pleasure of the king. So the only way people could participate was to revolt. But in the Constitution, we're not subjects of any ruler. We're citizens of the nation, and we have a continuous ability to exercise control over the state without revolution. So in America, we're not a two-sword country. We're a three-sword country. The state has a sword, the church has a sword, and the people have a sword. Now, why three? What you hear a lot is, why can't we just have two? Why can't we just give one sword to the people and one sword to the state? What's this church thing? Just go with this church thing. Just give one to each of those. Well, in history, we've got some examples of that. If it's the people and the state, remember, neither of them have absolute standards. Whatever the majority says is right is right. It's always a tug of war, first of all, over who constitutes the people. Here in America, the people have been very different, has a very different definition just in our 200 years. And then the tug of war is over the power and wealth wielded by the state. We're seeing that happen in America today. And when there's a conflict, it's never the people, it's always a person standing against the state. In my own life, in 2008, I ran the campaign of the gentleman who ran against Jack Murtha. You've probably heard of Jack Murtha. I ran the campaign of the guy who ran against him. We almost beat him. 2010, last year. I got contacted by the IRS. I went through a full fraud audit, 2 years worth of fraud audit, where I had to produce every turnpike toll receipt to be able to justify it. It's always a person versus the state. And of course, it was just random. It was just random that I came up for that year. It's always one person. So it's never a fair competition. We have lots of examples where the people in the state are the only two swords. None of them are places I would want to live. The state always emerges as the victor. If you remember the French Revolution, which happened shortly after ours, they only had two swords, the people in the state. Their republic did not live to be 21. Our republic is still here. You need 3 swords. Well, what you hear is about separation of church and state. Well, what does that mean? Well, the first thing you hear is that the folks, they didn't really mean for religion to be a part of it. This is Washington's farewell address. He said, of all the dispositions and habits that lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. I'm going to skip down. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. They meant for religion to be included. Jefferson, he only wrote one book. Wrote a million letters, but only wrote one book. He wrote Notes on the State of Virginia. He wrote it in 1782. This is what he said. He said, can the liberties of the nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction that these liberties are a gift of God? In other words, beyond the reach of the government. Did Jefferson mean to insert the word creator? Oh, you betcha. Yes, he did. We hear that the guys who signed the Constitution weren't Christians, so I went back and looked them all up. They all look Christian to me. The deist was Franklin. He actually attended an Episcopal church, but since he self-defined as a deist, I gave it to him. Our Constitution, in Article 6, this is a really unique article in the Constitution because this is the place in the Constitution where the federal government is forbidding the state legislatures from doing something. It reaches beyond federal down to the states and says there can't be a religious litmus test to run for office. Why? Remember, they came from England, oath of supremacy to the crown. You can't be made to do that in this country. And not only did they say that the federal government couldn't do it, in Article 6 they said none of the states could do it either. So that your right to your conscience is yours. They can't dictate. The limits in Article 6 are on the state. They're not on the church, and they're not on the people. You hear about the First Amendment. I know that's not the whole First Amendment that I just took out, the religious clause. I hear that, especially when I'm with college kids, and they're like, it's longer than that. I know, it's longer than that. We're all familiar with the Free Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. We've also heard that, so what that says is that there can't be a state religion. They can't stop you from expressing or acting from faith. Again, the limit's on the state. We hear about Jefferson's famous letter. This is the whole letter. It's not a long letter. Now, everybody talks about Jefferson's letter. Did you ever wonder why he wrote it? I mean, you know, he was the sitting president of the United States. He didn't get up one morning and say, gee, I think I'll write to the Danbury Baptist Association up in New England because I don't have anything better to do today. They wrote to him first. What did they say? They said, congratulations on being president. There's some magistrates up here who are really attempting to step on our religious liberty. We're so glad you've been elected president because you're a champion of religious liberty, and we're really counting on you to continue to be such a champion. And this was his response. Now, basically what he says is, because you've probably seen the letter, is that rights of conscience are natural rights, and he re-quotes the whole First Amendment. And he says the First Amendment is what is the wall of separation. It's not a limit on the church. It's a limit on the state. Recently, I debated the ACLU, and they went on about Jefferson's letter, which they don't exactly quote. And then I talked about, do you know what Jefferson did right after the weekend after he wrote that letter? He went to church. That was not unusual. He attended the largest congregation in Washington, D.C. Where did that congregation meet? On the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. Not only did Jefferson not have a problem with that church meeting in the chamber of the House of Representatives, he really liked good music. I don't know if you knew that about Jefferson, but he liked good music, and the choir of that church was evidently not very good. So he dismissed the choir of the church and had the U.S. Marine Corps band come in and play for the Sunday services of that church. If he didn't think it should be involved, he wouldn't have done that, would he? The poor ACLU people didn't like it so well when I talked about that. But that's the letter. Again, the letter says the same things. That government power is limited to actions. They can't establish a state religion. Rights of conscience are natural rights, and the church should be free of state interference. I know I'm moving you through this at a lightning speed. Everything in the Declaration and the Constitution limits the state. So remember those three swords? What is the sword of the church? The sword of the church is the sword that says right and wrong trumps legal and illegal. The sword of the church says that there are absolute standards. The sword of the church is a living reminder that there are legitimate limits on the power of the government. I always think it's funny when you think about it. I don't know any pastor who has an army. Now, maybe you do, but I have never met one that had an army. And you don't have to belong to a church. And if you belong, you don't have to attend. Nobody comes to your house and knocks on your door and drags you kicking and screaming. And if you attend, you don't have to listen. And any pastor I know will tell you that they look out at any congregation on Sunday morning and see half the people sleeping, so we know they're not listening. And if you listen, you don't have to obey. So why is the government so afraid of the church? Because the only power the church has is the power of persuasion. Because the church is a living, breathing, constant reminder that the state is not top dog. There are limits on what the state can do. This sword reminds us of that. The sword of the people says you can change your government and guard your liberty without a revolution. It's really quite dramatic in history, that ballot box. You know, because I have run for office, I've had people say, we want a revolution. You know, in real revolutions, real 4-year-olds get shot by real bullets, and that's not fun. We should use this before we ever think of using that. They didn't really like the sword of the state, because the sword of the state, you know, is kind of scary. So they put 3 branches in the federal government, hoping that they fight with each other instead of with you. They put oaths of office. When I run for office, what I hear all the time, and you've probably heard it too, people who stand up and say, well, you work for me, and you represent me, and so you have to do what your constituents tell you to do. That is false. That is absolutely not true. They do not work for you. They work for the Constitution. They do not swear an oath to do what the majority and the people of their district want. They swear an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of either the federal government or the state in which whatever you live in. The oath of office is supposed to limit their ability to act. And then they added the Bill of Rights because a bunch of the folks who wrote the Constitution were smart enough to say, we still don't trust the sword of the state. We're going to put more limits on it, and we're not going to sign the Constitution until that bill is there. They really tried to blunt the sword of the state. If you had to define the swords, the church's sword is words. The people's sword is votes. The state's sword is a sword. That's the one that has the army. What they were hoping when they built this American system was that the words of the church and the votes of the people together could control the force of the state. Remember, they came from England. The state had eaten the church, so so they added a sword, hoping that the two together could stop the one. Now, everybody's heard of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy. This fellow was a pastor in Boston. He preached a sermon in 1750. It was called A Discourse Concerning Unlimited Submission and Non-Resistance to the Higher Powers. It was a 40-page sermon. They were in church a lot longer then than we go today. The sermon was not only preached, it was published and circulated throughout Boston. It actually went to London, where it was also published and circulated. What did Pastor Mayhew say? Pastor Mayhew was a Congregationalist, which was the Puritans. That was what they called when they got here, they changed their name. He said, no civil leaders are to be obeyed when they enjoin things that are inconsistent with the commands of God. Disobedience, then, is a duty, not a crime. He said, no government is to be submitted to at the expense of that which is the sole end of all government, the common good and safety. If, therefore, that would not be promoted by submission to government, there is no ground or motive for obedience and submission, but for the contrary. John Adams called that the first shot of the American Revolution. It wasn't Lexington and Concord. It was a sermon, the words of the church. Go ahead. In the 1800s, we were a country embroiled in another huge issue, the slavery issue. Before the Civil War, we had the Great Awakening here in America, where pastors traveled across this nation and held like tent revivals. One of those folks was the Reverend George Cheever. He preached a sermon called God Against Slavery and the Freedom and Duty of the Pulpit to Rebuke It as a Sin Against God. It was also published and distributed. It was first preached in 1857. What did he say? He said, I'm more than ever convinced of the right and duty of every preacher to preach on the subject. He said, religion in politics pours the light of God's words upon men's corporate as well as individual crimes. Nothing can possibly be more hypocritical than the outcry about political preaching. He said, the truth is that the moment any sin passes from the individual to the nation and is sanctioned by law, then instantly the speech against it is branded as political preaching. So that if you wish to take all manner of sin from the touch and control of the pulpit, you have only to make it legal and national. Have we heard this? We can all think of many instances in today's society where that's true. You have given it a tabernacle, which you must approach only to worship. If a man has 2 wives, you can preach against polygamy, and nobody charges you with preaching politics. But if a state sets up polygamy by law, and its support be made a plank in the political platform of a party, then, if you touch upon it in the pulpit, you're preaching politics. That sermon is as relevant today as it was in 1857. But the church openly spoke on all the issues of the day up until 1954. Lyndon Johnson was at that time the senator from Texas. The Congress was rewriting the entire tax code of America, all tens of thousands of pages of it. Lyndon Johnson was being opposed by a couple of nonprofits in his state who were accusing him of corruption, because he was corrupt, actually. He wanted to stop them. So he walked into the Senate, said to the Speaker, I'd like to add a technical amendment to the 501c3 section of the code. I want to change this word to that word and this phrase to that phrase. Never said anything else. Speaker said, are there any objections? Nobody said anything. So ordered. Change was put in 1954. When you go back and read the congressional record, which I have, it's 6 lines long, literally 6 lines. That's all that was said. What was the effect of it? Well, I already did this. What was the effect of it was to say that no nonprofits, including churches, can endorse or oppose candidates for political office. He did it to silence his opposition. Now, as that amendment has taken effect throughout America, it has been used as a club to silence the words of the church across this country. We can debate for an hour, which I don't have, so we're not going to do, whether pastors should or should not stand up against it. The fact that that language exists is irrefutable. So they used the IRS tax codes to silence the words of the church so that there wouldn't be anybody to tell government right and wrong trumps legal and illegal. So we've removed the words of the church to control the force of the state. Well, we're left with the votes of the people. Enter the wonderful world of government entitlements. Now, this is, and it's hard to read because it's light in here, this is a partial list, and it's as many as I could fit on one screen, of government entitlement programs. At this moment, about 1/2 of the population of the United States of America participates in some government entitlement program somewhere. So when that happens, what you see is that the people now use their votes to guard their entitlements instead of their liberties. What you hear is cut government spending, but not in my program. Cut it over there, but don't cut mine. So it changed the way that people vote. So now, instead of the 3 swords that we need to remain free, we have the state controlling the church's sword through silence and half of the people's sword through entitlements. So the state's holding 2.5 of the 3 swords. And we wonder why this country's having a problem. Because we no longer are a 3-sword nation. So what do we do about that? I mean, how do we separate the swords? Well, it has to begin with restoring the proper role of the church. Because in order to change the entitlement mentality, you have to put the church back where the church belongs. Because not only is the church a voice, the church is supposed to be the social welfare agency in this nation. When Henry VIII was King of England, before he did what he did, the church in England owned 1/3 of the land. On that 1/3 of the land, they provided for 1/2 of the population of England. When Henry did what he did, he seized all the land and gave it to his nobles and his supporters, threw all those people off the land. and totally changed the complexion of England. The standard of living in England did not return to what it was the day before Henry VIII seized land until the 1960s. That's how long it took England to get back. If you want a really striking illustration of the difference in the country, read Chaucer and then read Dickens. That's the difference in England. When the church does social welfare, it works. Because then it's providing assistance instead of looking to create dependence. What we talk about today is, well, but people need help, and that's equated with the government has to help them. When the church provides help, what happens? Well, help is supplied by neighbors. They pass the collect. However they do it in your church. Like in mine, they do it the last Sunday of every month. That's the assistance collection, and it goes to the folks who need help in our church and anybody else in the community. However your church does it. The point is you're probably sitting beside somebody you've helped, and they're sitting beside you. And over the course of your life, sometimes you give the help, sometimes you get the help. It kind of evens out, and you're connected. It's about that connection and community and about neighbors helping neighbors. Everything's done case by case because the church goes in and sits down and talks to you, whoever it is, however your organization. And the church, it could be your parish or your community church, it could be the Salvation Army, the Benevolent Society. Those kind of church and community organizations that were neighbor-based and privately funded were case by case. Usually they tried to preserve the family. It became a priority. They sat down and analyzed your budget. Okay, I understand you can't pay your rent. You bought how many packs of cigarettes this month? Can we talk? Everything was flexible based on what did you need, what do we give you. So the whole complexion of it was different. Work was required, not because they didn't like you, but because they knew it was good for you. So even if all you could do was go to the church hall and stuff envelopes, you did that. And if you couldn't come, they brought the envelopes to your house. I mean, I've personally done that where I brought them to people's houses and said, okay, I'm going to come back tomorrow and pick these up, but I expect them all to be stuffed. And then the person felt like they were producing something. So it was good for them. It gave them dignity and honor and worth. The goal was to give you the least amount of help necessary. Some people really do need help for a lifetime. I have a very dear friend. She was an employee of mine for years. She has a daughter who is autistic. That little girl will always need help. But she gets the least amount. The goal is to give her the highest level of independence with the least of the safety net of what she needs. Or take you off as soon as you can. In Johnstown, a house burned down the other night. Those people are homeless. They weren't planning to be homeless. So of course everybody's helping. They're not going to get help for the rest of their life. They're getting put on their feet to move on, and they're going to move on. We have those experiences in our life. At least 85% of every dollar goes to a recipient, and in most programs run by the church, that figure is well over 90. And it's usually run by clergy or church elders or volunteers, and I don't know any pastor who is disappointed because 60 people didn't call him for help today. In his mind, that was a good day. He's not less of a pastor because he didn't have to provide social assistance. That was the definition of what it used to look like in this country. Now, you skipped one, I think. There you go. When the government does it, instead it's taxpayer funded, which from the point of view of the recipient means it's free because there's no connection between the giver and the receiver. Everything is done by a formula, which is kind of bizarre. So people who actually do need help get confronted with 70 pages of forms that they have to fill out and trying to figure out how to fit into an insane formula, and they are insane. Here in Pennsylvania, if you're a single mom and you're trying to get off of help and you want to be a hairdresser, cosmetology is considered training in Pennsylvania, and you can get assistance for that. If you want to be a bachelor degree nurse, that's not considered training, and you can't get help with that. Really? So a bachelor's degree isn't training, but a cosmetology license is? That's the formula. Isn't that insane? But that's what happens. Family breakup is sometimes required. I have a friend who's an attorney who tells me about senior citizens who don't get married so that they can each keep Social Security benefits, because if they get married, they lose, and they're barely making it now. The government should never be putting that kind of pressure. We take 16-year-olds and tell them if they have to move out of their mother's house, 16-year-old moms, and say you have to move out and start your own place in order to get help, even though we know that if she stays home with mom, she's probably going to finish high school and have a good outcome. If she moves into an apartment by herself, there's going to be another baby before she's 18 and we'll have a high school dropout on our hand. What sane person would want to do that? Well, the government does. Income levels are verified. They don't really care what you do with your money. We just care where it is. And the cutoff levels are rigid. Do you know, I was at the Harrisburg Patriot in the last campaign, and we were talking about that, and don't you want to help people? And I said, you do realize, in the final analysis, in any government program that has ever or will ever exist, the difference between rich and poor always comes down to 1 penny. 1 penny. Whatever the number is. You can do this up to $10,000. So if you make $9,999.99, you qualify. But if you make $10,000, you don't. That's a magic penny. I don't know that I believe in magic, but boy, the government sure does, because they have a magic penny. Work is punished in government programs. In Pennsylvania, there was a program, I actually participated in it. I was an employer. If you hired someone on welfare, the state paid half of their salary for 6 months. So I did. Well, when you hire somebody for the first couple of months, they don't even know where the bathroom is. You're not getting any production out of them. You're showing them where everything is. So I trained her, and it was fine, and she was a really good worker, and everything went well. And at the end of 6 months, the state called and said, so who did you want me to send next week? And I said, I really like the program, but I'm not expanding right now. I can't hire somebody else. Oh, well, no, when you lay her off. Why would I lay her off? I like her. She's doing a great job. Why would? Well, because, see, next month you won't get that the half of the salary. So what most employers do is they hire for 6 months, and then they lay off, and then they hire another one for 6 months, so that the state's constantly paying half of that salary. And I said, okay, I'm not doing that. That wouldn't be ethical. But just since I have you on the phone, what happens to her? What happens to all these people that you do this to? Well, the state does retrospective budgeting, meaning they always look at last month to determine your benefits for this month. So let's say it was January, I laid her off at the end of January. Now it's February, she has no income. They look back and say, but you had income in January, so you get no help in February. At the end of February, you can apply for assistance. Now we look back at February, so that was 0. So by the time you get to the end of March, this will kick in. Okay, but she's a young mom with a baby. What does she eat in that month of February? Well, that wouldn't be our problem because, we do retrospective budgeting. And so if she had stayed on welfare and not tried to get a job and not tried to help herself, she would have gotten these checks uninterrupted right straight through. But because this person made the attempt to get a job and got caught in a system where you've put businesses in a position where, well, it does better for me if I revolving door them. Now for that 6 weeks, she's going to eat nothing. So you punished the girl for working. Well, I mean, if you're going to look at it that way. Is there another way to look at it? Because I'm really kind of, flummoxed here. So we punish people who work. The goal is to maintain you on the program. We may move you from program A to program B to program C, but we never actually want you to be free of the program because then that government isn't there anymore. About 16% goes to the recipient. Now, if you go on the internet, it's really funny because they'll say, no, that's not a true number because the federal government's cost is only this amount. And that is true. The federal government's cost is it's not 85%. The federal government takes its share off the top. It's about 17. And they take the rest of the money, and they give it to the state. And what does the state do? Well, they take their cost off the top. And who do they give it to? Well, they take the rest of the money, and they give it to the county, who takes their administrative cost off the top. But the government only ever gives you the cost of their level. But the real program, almost all of these programs eventually wind up in the hands of a local municipality. In Pennsylvania, I don't know what it is in every state, but in Pennsylvania it's often the counties. So you have 3 layers of government, each of which are taking their costs off the top before it ever gets down to the person. And that number is actually real when you add all those numbers up. And it's run by workers whose job depends on that program continuing. So what are the effects of this program? Well, the government begins to compete with the church to provide assistance. And people stop giving because they say, well, I'm paying for this with my taxes. So it's there's already a tax program for this. I'm already providing it. I'm already paying for it. So just use that one. Why would I pay twice? So church donations go down, and they are down all over. The services, therefore, go down, so more people have to go to the government, so it goes up again. You put the church and community agencies in a place where they have to go to the government for funding. So the government wins either way. How sad is that? Program goals are different. In government programs, the goal is to keep people on the program to keep the job of the caseworker. It's to keep the program to elect those who promise to continue the program. You know, you've all seen the elected officials who come with the 5-foot check. I've given $dollars to the Blankenschmiel agency here, and aren't I wonderful? And everybody involved in that agency elects that person. Because remember, people vote to protect their entitlements instead of their liberty. So the politicians now want to keep the programs, because then those people are going to keep voting for them because they keep the programs in place. And then the goal is to grow the program, because the only way that you can get promoted in the government is to make your program bigger. Now, can you blame the people who want to keep the program to keep their job, or the people who want to get promoted? No. Don't you want to get promoted? Don't you want to provide for your family? The system is set up that we put people in a position where they have to do crazy things in order to survive themselves. It's the system that's broken. You can't vilify the guy caught in the middle of the system. It's the system. The recipient's behavior changes. It's way easier not to budget on this program. It's easier not to work. Short-term help becomes long-term dependence. And then there's a feeling of entitlement. In my last campaign, I was in the central part of the state, and a gentleman in the audience told me that he worked for some telephone company, reinstalled wires and whatever. And he was telling me about this house he was in, and he was in installing wires, and the lady said to him, "I hate Puerto Ricans." Okay, most people start with hello, but I'll bite. Why do you hate Puerto Ricans? And she said, because they're stealing my grandbaby's welfare. I'm on welfare, my daughter's on welfare, these Puerto Ricans are coming in here and stealing the welfare. That's my grandbaby's welfare. Wasn't supposed to be a family business, really. Feeling of entitlement to the program. Political effects. You get government spending, but not in my program. So fear becomes a political tool. Those who need help then become building blocks for power. We trade them. We've seen that happen. Everywhere we see it happen. Go along with this or your district will get nothing. So it's used to clobber those politicians who do want to stand up against the system. I had a friend who was a state rep, and they actually put his office in the hall of the Capitol. John Eichelberger, you've all heard of him, he's a senator from Altoona. He stands up against the system a lot. He has a hiring freeze, but other people don't. Because if you have less staff, you can do less community service, constituent service, so it's harder to get reelected. So it becomes a tool to browbeat the political leaders can use it to browbeat folks who want reform. They can make your election more difficult or less difficult, and they can force cooperation. And politically, everybody says, I want my piece of the pie. In what we have today, when the people who say to me, well, everybody should do what their district says, then John Murtha and Robert Byrd were, and I picked them because they're dead. Therefore, I'm not making a, quote, public political statement, because there's a lot of living people who do it too. They're heroes. Their districts wanted pork, and man, they were the best at delivering it.
Robert Byrd's name is all over the state of Virginia.
And if you live in Johnstown, which I do, you can't go one block without seeing Jack Murtha's name on something, or his wife's. So they did exactly what their constituents wanted. They delivered pork. They just did it better than everybody else. Politicians then bargain their votes. Remember the health care bill? Who bargained best? So it becomes a bargain basement shop. It pits segments of the population against each other. Since everybody wants their piece of the pie, instead of us voting to protect liberty, I'm voting to protect mine, and it allows class warfare or racial warfare or young against old, or you can put any against any. It doesn't matter what you put on either side of the seesaw. It pits one side against another, and corruption becomes inevitable. When government becomes the social welfare agency, it is always a poisoned well. And it destroys the very people it's supposed to serve. If we really want to change what's happening in America, that's the message we need to begin with. What you hear is, but people need help. Yes, they do. Government is never, almost never, the agency that should help them, because it doesn't help. It's a sword. Remember, the sword of the state is a sword. Swords are never helpful. And everything the state does is designed to increase its power. So we need to change the conversation. We need to end the silence. We need to repeal the Johnson Amendment so that the church once again starts talking about right and wrong instead of just legal and illegal. We need to change the conversation so instead of entitlement, we talk about assistance. Yes, people need assistance. In the course of your lifetime, you probably either have or will. So sometimes you're the giver. I say to my children, sometimes in your life, you get the blessing, and sometimes in your life, you are the blessing. And in the course of your life, it evens out. And you have to be willing to be both. But it's about helping each other. That's a whole different conversation. Instead of talking about government programs, we need to talk about how do we solve the problem. Different language. Instead of government, we should be talking about church and community. Instead of state, we should be talking about family. That's the center of society, not the government. We need to talk about a culture of liberty. There needs to be a national recognition that there are limits on the authority of the state, and an understanding that we're responsible to guard liberty. We need to restore the swords, which means we need to say it differently. Let me give you an example. There's huge debates about taxes. When I ran, I was in Philadelphia, and a lady stood up and this group pays too little and that group pays too much, from which I knew exactly which group she was in, right? And didn't I think that? And I said to her, okay, I'm going to answer your question. But before I answer your question, can I ask you a question? And she said, okay. What is the purpose of taxes? What? What is the purpose of taxes? Why do we pay taxes? Why do taxes exist? What's the purpose? Well, new thought. I said, okay. Isn't the purpose of taxes supposed to be how we, the citizens, fund the government? Yeah, I agree with that. Okay. So was the purpose for taxes supposed to be to give government a way to control you, the citizens? No. Do they use the tax code to do that? Yeah, oh, she said. Yeah, they do. Yeah, they tell you get a credit if you put new windows in, or you change your key, or if you're a business, if you hire new workers or upgrade your equipment, or whatever. You make decisions based on the tax code. Did you vote for the government to change the purpose of taxes from funding the government to controlling your behavior? No, I certainly did not. And the whole room went, no, I certainly did not. So shouldn't, instead of us talking about who pays how much, shouldn't we be having a conversation about when did the government change the purpose of taxes from funding them to controlling us? Because I didn't vote for that, and I don't think we should do that. And don't you really think? Yes. And the whole room turned. And by the time I was done, the whole room bought the fair tax, because the fair tax is anonymous. The government doesn't know who you are. When you buy a Pepsi, if you bought a Pepsi here and you paid sales tax in Pennsylvania, does the government know you paid that sales tax? No. And if you didn't want to pay that 6 cents, and if you didn't want to pay that 6 cents, you didn't have to buy the Pepsi. Right? Right. So shouldn't we have a tax code that starts by making you anonymous to the government, because then they can't control you? What a different way to look at taxes. Now we're not talking about tax envy, class envy at all. It's a whole different, it focuses on, there's legitimate limits on what the state's allowed to do, and you have liberties and you should protect them. It changes the conversation. If you begin the conversation here, the issues move. Everything else moves. What you hear a lot in the arguments about separation of church and state, it's really a red herring. It doesn't matter what church you personally belong to. That's your personal decision. But this is a nation that was founded on a belief in a God. The Declaration says we're endowed with rights by a creator. If there's no creator, we're not endowed. If there's not an authority above the government, there cannot be inalienable rights or a legitimate reason for dissent. The American Revolution was and is only justified by our belief that God exists and that he is the ultimate authority. If we remove God, we remove the very foundation of our heritage of freedom. We have to remain a nation under God to remain a nation that is free. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peg. There was so much good there. We wish we could have the full 3-hour version. And, you know, I think this provides, one thing that struck me, many things struck me, that one particular, sometimes people ask us, well, what's the difference between you and the Libertarian Party? There it is, right here it is. Now, they're a two-sword philosophical structure. We believe in the three swords, as did our founding fathers. I think that illustrates it so well, the difference between the philosophical underpinnings of our party as opposed to the Libertarian Party. Of course, you see how that's played out in policy and in issues, but that provides the philosophical underpinnings for it. So anyway, great. You know, we're working on a plan to be able to get this message out all across the country, and I think it also provides the philosophical foundation for the Tea Party movement. And there are a lot of people, Tea Party people out there who know the issues. They know what they believe on the issues, but they don't have a good foundation of why they believe it. They're instinctively on our side, but this provides the philosophical understanding and foundation for it, and I think provides the greatest opportunity for us to tie in with that movement as well.